Let me go ahead and start the program. My name is Jim Hollifield. I'm a professor here and the director of the Tower Center. I see lots of familiar faces in the room and a few whom I don't recognize who are here for the first time, but let me just welcome everyone. Normally my colleague Josh Rovner, who's sitting in front of me here, would be chairing this, but one of the things that, one of the reasons I wanted to chair this is I think I'm the only person in the room who was a student of Professor Clarke. I had a class with him when I was in graduate school at Duke University.
You remember what the title of that class was?
It was called The Comparative Political Elites.
That's right, very good. I should have given you a better grade.
Do you remember?
It was the best class on elites, Harold, that I ever had.
Of course, it was the only class on elites you ever had, too.
No, seriously, it was a fabulous class. I remember reading James David Barber's The Lawmaker.
That's right, and Bob Putnam's.
And Robert Putnam's.
Yeah,
whose
Bob
name
Putnam.
is familiar to people in the room here. But Harold is, I hate to say it, but someone who really needs no introduction, certainly in political science. He is currently at the University of Texas at Dallas. Are we going to make it with the PowerPoint, you think? Okay.
Let's still continue.
I'll continue, okay. And he holds the Ashbel Smith Professor of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences at the University of Texas at Dallas. He also teaches the summer methods course at the University of Essex in England. He has written widely on electoral politics, I think, across much of the democratic world, but specializing in really the Anglo-democracies. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, it's a fair statement, Jim.
Especially the United States, Canada, and Britain.
Yes, indeed.
And some of you may be surprised to know that the British National Election Study, the Canadian National Election Study,
that's right,
are handled locally here.
They have been. They have been. They have been. That's right.
So
that's right.
it is truly amazing, how much you've crammed into one career. And if you look at Professor Clarke's vita, it will blow your mind. Literally, he's got like a well over 100-page vita, and it is not fluff. I never counted how many APSR articles you published. Have you lost track yourself? This is our premier journal, but a lot. So we should all, join in welcoming Harold. Do you have a printed version of your PowerPoint?
I don't. I said, oh, you guys, no, I won't do that. All I have is my flash drive, which if anybody's got a computer, we can go ahead.
Somebody got a computer? You want to try to hook it up?
It's just a projector.
The PC. It's a Mac. There's an adapter for it.
Is it easily found?
All right. Well, why don't we just let's just take a break for a minute until.
Because I used to run all our presentations off of plug into it.
Yeah, all we need is to grab a computer.
What's she doing with that computer?
But we can.
What's that?
Was she just rebooting?
I don't know where she took off with
I think she was going to
try to make it work.
try to make it work.
Well, let's just wait for a few minutes. So just chill out for.
Well, we can actually.
You got a computer?
We can. All we need is somebody with a laptop.
Come on and have
computer. Well, while we're waiting, let me thank Jim for his very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming out today and taking time out of your busy schedules to listen to what I have to say. As we go along, please, feel free to ask questions, as we go. There's sort of two kinds of rules. There's political science rules where you wait to the end and let me be very polite. And then there's economic rule, for the economists where you can't get one word out of your mouth,
before they
stomp on you. And so we'll sort of go down the middle on this, and so take questions as we go along. This presentation today is dealing with public attitudes towards overseas aid in the United States in comparative perspective. And the comparative perspective is with three other largest donor countries in terms of amount of money supplied for overseas aid, namely Great Britain, Germany, and France. And this project had its beginning just off DuPont Circle a couple of years ago in early December at a place called the Fairfax Hotel. Some of you may be familiar with the Fairfax. My wife and I always go in early December. We go to a play. We always go up to D.C. and go to see A Christmas Carol. And so it turns out to be sort of appropriate for this kind of topic at Ford's Theater every year. Well, we had just arrived 2 years ago in early December, and as is our wont, we had repaired to the bar at the Fairfax. And we're checking our, of course, we were working, and checking our email and so. And I saw an email from a good friend of mine who I do a lot of work with, from YouGov, a survey company headquartered in Britain, a guy by the name of Joe Twyman, who some of you may know. And Joe asked if Marianne and I would be interested in participating with him to do a number of surveys with one of his major clients on overseas aid, and not just chronicling attitudes towards aid, but actually trying to model it, trying to understand what is associated, what's associated with variance in people's attitudes towards overseas aid. And so we said, oh yeah, this sounds like an interesting project. And so we signed on. We lost our weekend, basically, because he wanted instantaneous sort of help. Right now, you've got to help me. You're my friend, please help me. And so we did. We dug in and started to do this kind of work. We did some preliminary surveys, and then signed on to do 40 surveys in these 4 countries, national panel surveys, big surveys, large N surveys ranging from about 6,000 to 8,000 respondents, maybe a little less, 5,500 to 8,000 interlocking panel surveys over the next 5 years. And so what I'm talking about today is the results of the first of these surveys, this round of surveys. We've actually now done 2 rounds of surveys in the 4 countries, and the results are remarkably consistent so far across the 2 ways in the 4 countries. But we'll focus. The actual data I'm going to show you come from surveys that we conducted in December and January this year, which I hope to show you. Which I hope to show you. And the sort of premise, I think, for talks like this, and it's already come up this afternoon. We were talking to a colleague in Jim's office before we came down here, was, Americans are really terribly negative about overseas aid. Oh, that's terrific. Look at that. It's fantastic.
Maybe we're going to have...
Kevin, cross your fingers.
And there we are. Great. Input.
Let's see if this one works.
There we go. Thank you so much. And I just hit... Okay, great. So we just got to this particular slide here, and we're talking about the size of the different samples. They vary a little bit from wave to wave, but the field work is all done by YouGov. I see you've got a YouGov pen. That makes me feel good. I do a lot of work with those guys. Anybody wants to do some surveys, just ask me, and I'd be happy to help you.
Harold is not allowed to say who the client is.
That's right. Not publicly, I'm not supposed to, but privately.
But I can't say it.
Well, you can say whatever you want, sir. Obviously.
The client is our Bill and Melinda Gates. The study was done for the Gates Foundation. So,
yeah. So
but don't. That's not for attribution.
So one of the things we find, just to start with, some of the descriptive things, and we've got a wide variety of measures in our surveys. But the story that Americans are negative towards overseas aid, that's absolutely true. And however, one of the interesting sort of takeaway points right away is they're not unique at all. That in fact here we've got this little scale running from 0 to 10, give no aid, give aid very generously on a 0 to 10 scale. You can see that the American and the British distributions are very, very similar, and the mean for the UK is 3.7. For the United States, it's 3.6. So it's very similar. France is very similar again, and the Germans, as we'll see, and this is a sort of consistent finding, are a little more positive. They're not wildly enthusiastic about aid, but they're a little more. They're a little more enthusiastic. Now, when we're talking about aid here, we're talking about government. These questions here have to do with government provision of overseas aid, not individual charities, like where you might just say, okay, I'm going to give some money to a private charity, and they're making a pitch to do overseas aid. It's not that. This is attitudes towards government provision. So one of the takeaways right away is that, yes, aid's unpopular in the United States, but it's unpopular in other countries as well. Now, whether this would hold up in some of the smaller Scandinavian countries, which proportionately give considerably more of their budget to aid, even though the total amount of dollars is not that great because they're small countries, we don't know. There's been some discussion of doing some one-off surveys in those countries as well. I hope that comes to fruition. Attitudes towards increase, the same story here. Same story. The percentage of people who want to increase aid in 3 of the 4 countries as opposed to decreasing it is dwarfed. 15% in the U.S. versus 51, 16 versus 53. It's only in Germany where you get a much more balanced sort of picture. But even then, you've got nearly 2/3 who either want to keep the budget where it is or decrease it. So again, Germans are somewhat more enthusiastic, but not really terribly enthusiastic. Now, here's another stylized fact that a lot of you will already know, is that people, not just in the United States, but everywhere, vastly overestimate how much money the government budget is dispensed in terms of overseas development assistance or overseas aid. And you can see here are the real figures here, and then here are the survey estimates. And so again, it's not just the U.S. Not just the U.S. It's everywhere. Okay, and so overseas aid has a bad rap, not just here, but quite consistently. Now, one of the things we did right away was to try to see whether or not, if we actually told people, said, well, hey, the amount being spent is less than 1% of the budget. It's less than 1%. And would that change your mind, basically? Would you be willing to give more? And people say, no, I won't. Talk about going to, so this thing is really, as I say, starting this with the Christmas Carol, with Scrooge and so forth, it's absolutely true, People are look at these numbers. Decrease, 53, 52. This is after we've told them. We've told them what the true story is, So, just ignorance is not the answer. Just sort of simple ignorance of what's going on is not the answer. How do we explain, then, public attitudes towards overseas aid? Well, when we were wrestling in the bar there at the Fairfax on how we design these questionnaires, right away, as social scientists, it's not enough. We're not just pollsters. We don't want just marginals. We want models. Models, not marginals, okay? And so we started thinking about what might be some of the factors that would be involved. And as a political scientist studying voting trends, some of you would be familiar with the famous Riker-Orderschuk PB minus C plus D model. That people vote because of a combination of some kind of subjective expected utility calculation plus some kind of civic duty, feeling or whatever we're going to call it, sentiment, impulse. We say, well, look, probably the same kinds of things. Combinations of prudence and morality explain a lot of the stuff we do in life. We don't always just do what we think is right, and we don't always just do things that we think will benefit us in some sense. Either individually or collectively. So it's some kind of mix. So we argued that as proximate, cause or things to investigate, conjecture that we had a hypothesis was to try to design this questionnaire to tap both perceived benefits and costs, perceptions of the effectiveness or likelihood that efforts to do development would be successful, and then the simple right and wrong, the kind of thing that I can recall as that's a good Methodist school here, as a member of First United Church of Canada, which was a union of Methodists and Presbyterians. As a teenager, our club, like our church club, adopted, a young kid from, I think, from Nigeria at the time. And of course, the appeal that was made was just a straight moral appeal. They showed you some starving people, is what they starving kids, and that kind of appeal. When I started, I said, "Oh, that's it," but it's not, as we'll see. The prudential side turns out to be very important. And so, there, for those of you who are actually number crunchers, there's a little model there, very simple sort of model that we start off with. Our job, of course, we'll try to figure out what those weights are, what those regression coefficients are, using our data to do that, standard kind of thing, and we will be doing multivariate statistical analyses of the parameters with controls for other predictors. And that's just a little summary of some of the ways. There are lots of ways you can do this, okay? But basically, for the presentation I'm going to give you this afternoon, we're going to focus on this question that I showed you before, the distributions before, the 0 to 10 scale. We actually have more elaborate composite scales as well, measures of effectiveness. Benefits, cost, and morality. Let me just spend a minute or two just showing you a little bit the distributions, how people see the benefits and costs and morality of aid, and the effectiveness. We'll start with effectiveness. And again, one of the things we see right away is, that's not working very well, is it? Yeah, I guess so. It's just, but you can see, very few people are up here at the top end of the scale on effectiveness. Mm-hmm. It's not just that people don't like aid or something like this, or they're Scrooges. They don't think it works. Mm-hmm. They don't think it works. And of course, for those of you who do developmental economics, if there's anyone who does that, of course, there's huge debates about the effectiveness of aid. With some very prominent economists like Angus Deaton at Princeton and so on recently arguing that aid, despite the fact he is on the left politically and is very sympathetic to the idea of aid, he's recently written in a big book that that it's no good, it doesn't work, And then there's all sorts of debates about people who say, well, it'll work if we do this, if we went, if instead of doing, like Jeffrey Sachs, and so all these guys have plans for how to do it, and do it locally, do it nationally, how to set it up, how to run it, and this is a big idea. Yeah.
I imagine you do this, but let me just ask if you break down the category of foreign aid into military, economic, humanitarian.
This is all humanitarian. Yeah. This is not, and this of course is a problem, in terms of how people see it. You could argue one of the sort of reasonable hypotheses that people allied all this stuff in their minds, and they mix them up, and they like one kind, but they don't like the other. They like the humanitarian, but they don't like the military, or vice versa. And that's an interesting idea, and we try to set up our surveys, to set up the introduction so they know that we're talking about basically about developmental assistance and various kinds of humanitarian aid ranging. Of course, there's a spectrum there of things. Of course, that's a broad spectrum. There are lots of activities that you could talk about. And of course, one of the things we try to do is to find out which of these things they like. Yes?
Yeah, so there's the presumption that this kind of aid doesn't help the national interest, right? Whether or not it helps the recipient's interest, it doesn't have anything
to do with that. We'll get to that. That's right. We'll get to that.
That might explain some of the results.
Well, sure. Exactly. Of course. Let's take a look at a few more of these distributions because they're interesting, and the kinds of distinctions you're raising are things that we've tried to pick up in our surveys, and we'll be doing more as we go forward. And of course, I'd appreciate suggestions you might have for things we might pursue. Morality of aid. This one may surprise me. And this is typical. We have several questions on morality, but this one, giving more aid is the right thing to do. Well, I thought everybody would say that. Just social desirability bias in the survey would make people say that they agree with that. But just look at the agrees versus the disagrees. Sizable pluralities are saying they disagree. They don't think it's the right thing to do. And I'm really surprised because as a survey researcher, I said, gee, people at least will say it. They may not believe it, but they'll lie to me and tell me, yes. And then, yeah.
Could you say something about question ordering? I can imagine a sort of like desire to reduce cognitive dissonance if people are first say they think there should be less aid and are then asked whether it's effective or whether it's moral, then they may be more likely to say it's not effective and it's not moral in order to be consistent with their earlier statement that they want.
We do a lot of stuff in terms of question, like ordering effects and things like that, to try to deal with. You're always worried about rationalization and projection and so forth. So we rotate. We rotate a lot of questions and randomize them and things like this, up to a point. People want to have a conversation in their survey. You can't just sort of randomize everything because people say this is totally incoherent and they turn it off. And it is, but that's a good idea. That's always with any of these kinds of things. But we'll see. One of the things that we'll see is just how powerful some of these explanations are. So you get some checks. It's not just marginals; it's models. Yes.
What were the years that you were doing this poll?
We did some preliminary surveys. The data you're looking at here this afternoon are from December and January of this year, and they're very similar to survey results that we have coming out of the field in July and August.
I can imagine if you'd done this in 1998 to pick a good year, you would have gotten still negative, but not nearly as negative outcome.
Yeah, I think those we're doing these over several years, and one of the things we're interested in is whether or not events in the world or conditions may well affect responses. And in this regard, of course, the amount of turmoil we've had this year around the world is really, very, very substantial, and we're conjecturing now about how that might affect people's attitudes. Is it going to make them more positive, more negative? What's it going to do? Then also economic conditions. One of the things we do in our individual level modeling already is control for economic evaluations. People have the old idea that that charity, more broadly, not just overseas aid, but this whole idea of charitable giving is that this is the luxury good argument, that people, I can afford to give money away now. I'm rich, I can give money. That kind of argument. And it turns out that economic evaluations at the individual level do have predictable relationships along those lines, but they're far from that's just a small part of the story. Again, benefits. Helps prevent terrorism. Like there are various arguments about the benefits of aid for the people who are doing the giving, okay, and not just the recipients but the donors. And so one of the things we find again and again is that people don't believe the benefits argument. There are a lot of people that just simply do not believe it. Okay, these numbers are, basically you can see those blue lines, those disagree with with this proposition, again, dwarf the red bars. Economic arguments for donors. We build up the economies of these countries. That's going to feed back to help our economy. They become customers of ours, paying customers. And there are a variety of arguments like this. And it turns out that none of them resonate nearly as positively as I thought they might. And again, here you've got always about 2/3 of the people who either say they don't know or they disagree. And actually, the don't know argument is probably pretty good. If you ask me, well, hey, what are the economic consequences of spending on ODA? And I said, gee, I don't know. I'm not sure if is there a general answer to that? Is it country specific? If I give overseas aid to South Africa, that helps. But if I give it to Nigeria, it doesn't, or if I give it here or there, what's the answer to this? So the don't know response to this is pretty substantial, or people who put themselves in the middle, which is another way of saying don't know often, of course, is again, not surprising. Here's the one, though, that really, there's a lot of, take a look at this one. Most aid money goes to corrupt politicians in the developing world. This is what I call the Mass Ave Mercedes phenomenon, okay? when you're up in D.C., we always go walking up Mass Ave, and we go past these various embassies, and there'll be young people, usually young men, lounging on the side of a very nice car, and we say, oh my gosh, there's your aid money at work, okay? And so this is a really widespread perception, this what they call the bottleneck phenomenon in the literature, that none of the money gets, or very little of the money that you give gets down to the programs and people who need it. And so we've got a number of questions like this, and this is a very typical response distribution. As you can see, people who agree this. And in the, as they say, in the sector, there's a tremendous interest in this, as I found out. I didn't realize how interested people who work in this are, in the corruption phenomena, and how to address it, like how to develop what they call messaging that will offset this. And so it's true. They're right. It's a really, it is a very important part of the story, because that's on the cost side. That's on the cost side. Now, other considerations matter too, though. Moving back in that famed funnel of causality, if you move back and start asking people about their values, about their racial attitude, like on race, ethnicity, they're trying to measure ethnocentrism, say proxied by attitudes towards immigration and what have you, which we do, we find these things are important determinants of attitudes towards aid. And I wanted to ask the question, there's a standard battery in the American National Election Study developed by David Sears out at UCLA, a political psychologist, and Michael Tesler, one of his students. And it's been used in a lot of studies, since 1988, I think. I wanted to ask this question in our studies. Had a lot of trouble getting agreement from the client to do this, because they said, well, basically, this is uncomfortable. We don't want to do this. Almost like we don't want to know this. But it's true. We were able to convince them to ask it, and no matter how you do your modeling, these more basic attitudes, in groups, out groups, ethnic and racial biases that people may have matter. And of course, a lot of the aid that goes to African countries, countries in the Middle East, and so forth. And so it becomes a reasonable conjecture, like with events that are going on in the world, people become more negative towards, particularly countries in the Middle East. This may well sharpen some of these negative attitudes, which, net of everything else, are important determinants of aid, and they're important determinants of more proximate determinants of aid. And that's what our analysis is showing. And it's not a happy story, but it's something that we need to know, because it is, it's part of trying to really understand what's going on. So here's a typical sort of model that we develop, where our key concern is up here with the PB minus C plus M, but of course we're controlling for lots of other things. And in this particular example, we have got the ethnocentrism and ethnic racial attitudes, liberal conservative ideology. To be sure, in the United States, sort of in terms of basic profile, who supports aid? Democrats, young people, women, liberals. Okay? Just like you would expect. Right? This is what you would expect. However, those relationships are not that strong. They're there, but they don't tell the whole story. If you can convince people about the benefits of aid, you can really go a long way. And that's a very important message, of course, for people in the ODA sector. This is a really simple analysis here. Just OLS regression. Nothing really fancy here. And here's some comparative models. And this is a really neat story, though. The idea is that the PB minus C plus D model, or plus M model, as we call it here, takes us pretty well, an approximate sense, all the way we want to go. All the way we want to go. Here's our demographics and economic evaluations plus partisanship. Okay? Explains a little bit, not a lot. Values and belief, though, really take us a lot more. This is the ethnocentrism, the racial ethnic attitudes. But then if you go with the efficacy discounted benefits, costs, and morality just by themselves, these are what we call rival non-nested models. You can see they do better still, all by themselves, than if you put the whole thing together. The differences are very small. The pattern is very consistent across the countries. This is the other thing that's exciting. When I started this, I remember 2 years ago with our preliminary pilot surveys, sitting at a place down in Florida, down in Delray Beach, and spending my holidays developing these initial analyses. And I was unhappy having to do this or doing it in a way, but then when I started getting into it, I said, oh wow, the generality is just remarkable, and this is really interesting across these different cultures. And there's just a little sort of summary of the direct effects in this particular model. We've pretty well covered this. And then we went ahead, we've done work, how can we move things, okay? What can we do? What's the payoff? If I could really convince you of the benefits of aid, what's the payoff? How big is the payoff? So we've done those kinds of analyses. And it turns out that indeed the benefits are the biggest effects, the biggest change, if we could do it, are on the benefit side. If I can convince Professor Hollifield of benefits as a typical respondent here, then this is going to have the biggest payoff. Morality, not quite as much, and then costs less. So in terms of messaging, you say, well, maybe we could really get some real gains here if we work on benefits and to some extent on morality. And in our most recent round of surveys, we started to do survey experiments to see what happens if we change the message. Not just in terms of words, but showing pictures and so forth to people, and stories, vignettes. Does this change? We're doing survey experiments. We've got big N's, so we can do lots of treatments. And it turns out that you can get some sizable changes on these scales with our treatments, with our survey experiments. But the big question is whether they last more than 5 minutes. Right? It really is. This is one of the problems with experimental work in the social sciences more generally, is does this stuff really stick? Are you really getting something that transcends the experiment, the lab experiment, the survey, or what have you? Yes?
Just to clarify on this, is that the bump or is that the total level?
That's the total bump. That's the bump.
From going from
if I could take you
no benefits to full benefits?
If I could take you suppose you were a real skeptic about the benefits of aid. If I could move you across that benefit scale, I could move you on the 10-point scale, 6.1, 6 points, and that's huge. That's enormous. And we could put confidence intervals around. We can do fancier things, but it's still the same story. It's a big move. Benefits are potentially, if I can talk to you about and get you to believe about benefits, it looks right now, we're early days, of course, it looks like we're able to get some very sizable movement. And this is just, we've got a variety of analyses like this. But okay, are the results robust? As some of you may know, if you there's this whole literature on robust statistics and robust models, going back to the work of a guy back in the 70s who used to be at Chapel Hill early on, Ed Leamer. Extreme bounds analysis. But one of the things that's sort of cool is then to take a look at this model, which I'm touting here for you this afternoon, and control for all possible combinations of other variables. And so I did this, and so I ran 49,152 regressions before breakfast the other day. On Sunday morning, as a matter of fact.
That was on the UTD supercomputer, right?
Just on my little computer, just like this, okay? Just like that. And so the idea is, this is a really, the message is that it appears to be a very, very robust set of results. And so that's fun, it's easy to do. And so all 49,152 PB terms were positive and significant. All 49,152 C's and all 49,152 M's. So, anyway, if you like large numbers, it looks like we're on.
How long would that have taken on the old mainframe?
At Duke,
where we
at the A-Rod building. A long time.
I just have to tell you one little quick anecdote here. When I was a graduate student at Duke, I was on the graveyard shift managing the social science lab, and this is in the days of the old printers with the paper and the card punches and everything. And I can remember at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, this gentleman sitting there with a pipe, smoking a pipe, punching computer cards, and that was Professor Clarke.
That was back in the days when they had computer cards and pipes. That's right. So,
On campus, wow.
indirect effects too. I don't want to leave you with the idea that the PB minus C plus M model is the only thing these values, these personality characteristics, these attitudes towards groups, in-groups, out-groups, and so forth, which are so important in politics generally, are important here as well. And not surprisingly, it's not surprising, as I say, we had a little bit of a sell job to do with the client to get this to go, but I'm glad we were able to do it.
So the politics here, you're saying, are predictable?
Right now, that's the point. Most of this work in this field, there's lots of surveys about people's attitudes towards overseas aid. Most of it, though, is just sort of public opinion polling. And they do what we call marginals. They just get the distribution of answers, and they leave it that way. And that's not good enough. If we're going to actually understand something about a client who obviously is interested in an outcome, to get more positive attitudes and to have effective programs and so on, you need public support. How do you get it? You've got to learn about how to get it. So that's it. Yes?
It doesn't actually fit in this category, but I'm just thinking, did you do any special cases like Israel, which might have a special place faced for Germany and the U.S., but not necessarily for Great Britain and France? And that might be more military than
yeah. No, I think that's sort of that's a very good idea. I like that a lot. I think about that going forward. In other words, if you're thinking about what gets people to be more positive, for example, one of the things is just targets.
Yeah.
And targets can be sort of sectors like programs, or they can be groups or nations. And I think that's a really good idea going forward. And I hope we can incorporate. I think that's a dandy idea, and I would expect to see some differentiation as well. For example, yes.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, for example, with Canada, when I was a kid, the part of the pitch was not just a moral pitch, but it was to other Commonwealth countries. It was that kind of idea. Yes.
I was just going to say, but Jim trying to make this look like it's predictable politically, but then your comment about if you can convince someone that the benefits are there, it doesn't necessarily matter whether how their political persuasion is. Did I understand that correctly?
There are a variety of things that matter. The things that matter most are the benefits, costs, and morality. But further back in that chain, when you get back to values and so forth, you see very substantial effects, and they actually so far tend to dwarf. They dwarf partisanship. They dwarf liberal conservative ideology. Surprised me a bit. Not that these things are statistically insignificant. What isn't significant with 8,000 cases, though, right? So it's really the size of the effects that matter. But the story is not just a simple sort of story. Young men, or young women, liberals, Democrats, women are the people who like aid, and other people don't.
Let me
more
just follow up to that. Okay, so USAID, our number one overseas granting agency.
Yeah.
I think the reason people have the attitudes they do, particularly anyone that's interfaced with USAID in a developing country, will soon learn that USAID is just a name, and that there's a labyrinth of middlemen along the way. Beginning in Washington, the whole industry is built around implementing USAID funds. It goes from there to the developing world as well, where I've been to USAID projects in developing countries, and there are, at best, some local contractors that are implementing the work at that point. And that's good to hire locals to do that kind of thing. But the amount of money that starts up here and finishes down here.
Well, that's the bottleneck phenomenon.
About a 90% take along the way.
People have two things. They have an intuitive appreciation of this, although they don't know USAID from the Washington Nationals. But they also also weighted heavily. They weighted heavily, and this is something that people in the sector, quote unquote, really emphasize. We have more questions on corruption in these surveys than I would have ever, recommended as a survey researcher. But it's because they're so worried about this.
Yeah. Now
they're so worried about it.
Now listen, I'm on the board of directors of a U.S. Overseas Development Agency. It's called the Inter-American Foundation. It's small. No one's probably in this room ever heard of that. It is different than USAID. USAID tends to be government to government. This agency is government to the grassroots. So in other words, it's primarily tax money. We have an appropriation every year. But the money we give in grants goes to local citizen groups that have organized themselves and that come with us with a plan. Now, our studies back in history over this since 1961 indicate that these projects, on balance, work. They're beneficial. Incomes rise, all sorts of health indicators rise, etc. It has been impossible to get USAID to take more grassroots approach to overseas funding. I think the biggest impediment to changing attitudes is this industry, this, what do you want to call it, the military-industrial, not the military-industrial, the aid-industrial complex that's been built up around this thing. And to see the amount of money that doesn't ever get where it's intended to go. You have a starving child right there, and they're going to put in a health care, they're going to put a hospital in the community. Well, USAID gives money to the government of Haiti. Haiti turns around and negotiates with its Ministry of Health for a year or two. They finally give them some money. There's 3 or 4 or 5 more middlemen before, excuse me. That's Haiti calling right there.
There you go. No, I think
you get a hospital.
The point is well taken.
That's the problem.
And it's certainly something that people are, as I say, it's not just other people working like yourself, but our survey respondents. They have a strong intuition. You can see the data about these kinds of what they call bottleneck problems and so forth. And it's clearly something that's out there. And again, when you're talking about costs and benefits, if you're messaging, you say, hey, this is an important thing to address. I know my own attempts to try to interface with USAID to try to do some things have not been successful at all. But the idea that bureaucrats can get in the way, even with the best intentions, of course, is a fundamental one in political science. So let me just give you the conclusions. Takeaways: American attitudes towards overseas aid are not unique. The negativity we see here is something that we see elsewhere.
And when I said to Jack earlier that the politics are predictable, I was thinking comparatively. What you say is that the politics is pretty much the same.
It is. There's a lot of commonality. This again and again and again. These models work the same way across. We've done this 3 or 4 times now across the 4 countries. Actually 5, because we had Spain as a case earlier on. Many think aid's not effective. Many question the benefits of aid for donor countries and for recipients. And then large majorities, like we're just saying, think that corruption, or at least bottleneck and or bottlenecks. Sometimes you get bottlenecks or just bureaucratic things. It's not intentional corruption. It's just a really big, clumsy bureaucracy. Yes.
Just to stay on this last point, I'm wondering if for recipients, it's not a clear distinction between benefits and costs. When even if I'm convinced as an aid donor that the kid is going to get his medicine, or somebody's going to get a mosquito net, or whatever it is, I might also worry that by providing this aid, I'm propping up a nasty government, right? Or I'm giving that nasty government extra resources that it wouldn't otherwise have to buy bad stuff, right? Or worse yet, that I'm causing moral hazard. I'm giving a license for governments to behave badly because they know that Uncle Sam or Great Britain or whoever else is going to pick up the cost of doing what they ought to be doing. So is it necessarily a cost argument, or is it the benefits themselves are benefiting the wrong people?
Chelsea wants to get in.
Yeah, we have questions on both, a variety of those things. Yeah. Those kinds of distinctions, again, are things that you start talking to people who do this kind of work, they make those distinctions, right? Can you ask something about this as opposed to that? And sure, those are reasonable conjectures. To me, like some of the bottleneck stuff, I saw that's just the cost of doing business. It's like The Godfather, it's the cost to keep my store open.
I'm just
they're going to come around and threaten to kneecap me. Well, I'm going to pay because I want to keep open. And so, given how little we spend, I'd be happy to up the amount if I could get more. That's one way of getting more dollars through.
I'm just wondering. My question is more specific. Do recipients express this? That there's this value trade-off there?
I don't think we've actually asked it quite that way. We have asked questions, as I say, along the lines of like, are you willing to pay, like the cost of business kinds of arguments. And people basically say no. This is the interesting thing, is we try to get them to think about tolerating some corruption, quote unquote, or bottleneck phenomena in order to get the money through. Okay, it's worth doing, even if not all gets through, or we give more and so on, to try to get more through. People in general don't buy that. Corruption's bad. They say no, can't have any corruption, can't have any bottlenecks. And they take a very rigid sort of stand. The work we've done so far, the experiments we've been doing, I was surprised. I thought there'd be more guys. It's well, that's the way the world works. I've seen The Godfather. I know you got to pay money to do business. And that there are bad guys out there I'm going to have to deal with. But I'm dealing with the bad guys because there's a good result.
Yeah, I think Chelsea wanted to get in, and then Carissa.
Oh,
Sure.
No, it's okay.
You passed it.
We're past.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm sorry.
Carissa wants to ask.
Yes. Okay.
So the first thing was actually that an increasing amount of aid, although to varying degrees based on the aid agency, is actually being funneled to not to the state. Right, so like less and less of the total aid budget goes to state governments anymore, and more goes to NGOs and other non-state entities. Although
so the
USAID
Inter-American model is
coming
more
up. I mean, that's not every agency is doing this to the same extent, but they're all doing it.
They all want to
more
do it.
over time.
Yeah. Now that's and there are these. Of course, in the literature, there are all these debates, not just about this, but much more specific kinds of debates within that. So why can I do that? Well, then who do I give it to? What do I do? What kind of activities do I do? Do I do it? Do I go right down to the villages? Do I build roads? Do I do this? All these debates. The Jeffrey Sachs's huge project has actually sort of energized a lot of these debates as people reflect upon the failures.
Yes, I get very angry about all of the ways in which the Millennium Villages project has been terribly.
Yes, that's right. But exactly though, they use it as like sort of a real world huge experiment, and they say, well, it worked here. Some of this worked, some of it didn't. And they try to dissect it. And there's a whole literature I've learned about on this. And economists are involved, sociologists, political scientists, policy guys. You've seen all this. Next step, more survey experiments. What drives the PBC and M terms. We're currently doing wave 2 right now. One of the things also that I might mention is that we are actually doing market segmentation analysis on the behavior of people. And we've got 18 items about involvement, behavioral involvement in aid activities, broadly defined. Everything from writing to your congressman, about overseas aid matters, to actually volunteering as an overseas aid person, either domestically or part-time or full-time. And of course, a lot of people, you have to ask about time, not just money, because a lot of people say, "Gee, I really want to help, but I don't have money. I can't do that. But I can give time." So, what we find there, though, and this is again interesting, across the 4 countries, again and again, we get exactly the same 5-group solution in our segmentation analyses. And those groups range from what we call the totally disengaged, the marginally engaged, the informationally engaged. There's a group of people out there who just follow these phenomena, and they talk with each other about the kinds of strategies and results. And they don't do much else, but that's what they do. Then there are people who are behaviorally engaged. I sort of think about like the church ladies when I was a kid and so on, who would come around and talk to us, and they do that kind of work. Or they'll be involved with various kinds of groups, volunteer groups and so on. And then there are the so-called totally engaged guys, a very small group in each country who really are into this, like totally into this, and they volunteer, they go abroad. They, part of their careers they'll spend in things like the Peace Corps and various kinds of equivalent kinds of activities, or they'll go and volunteer. They'll go and volunteer for Doctors Without Borders and things like this, And so, again, the message is the United States isn't unique here. We've got exactly the same distributions almost across the four countries. And it's really remarkable.
Very interesting. Well, let's give them a round of applause.
Guys, I assume a lot of you saw the Roosevelt show, Ken Burns. I thought it was a fabulous show. If you haven't seen it, see it, and so I was looking for something to go with the
And there she
with
is.
the question, and there she is. So I thought that'd be a good way of sort of getting these together.
Eleanor
So-
Roosevelt. Well, before we leave and break up, I know some of you probably got to go to class and things like that, but I do want to give the students and others a chance to weigh in and ask some questions.
Sure, please do.
I'm tempted to call on some people. I know there are some here who really do study these things, but let's open it up for more general questions. You got to have questions. Paul, let's start with Paul. You're not a student, but you're close.
Was a student very recently. Well, thank you for a very interesting presentation. My question was actually a little bit off the very last point you said, where the United States is not unique, but Germany was a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was marginally more supportive of foreign aid. And if the basic takeaway of the story is, as I understood it, convince people it'll be more effective, they'll be more willing to support foreign aid. Are Germans just a little bit better at doing this? I mean, is that what's explaining? Can we learn something from them? Or is there something else explaining why Germany's better?
Well, this is a multivariate model, so I don't want to leave the idea that it's only moving benefits seems to have the biggest effect. Moving perceived costs has the smallest effect. In reality, though, is still pretty powerful. So you could go back and you could say, okay, well, let's take case by case. Do I get more bang for the buck in Germany by moving? We can go back to and take a look at that simulation that we did. But for these 4 donor countries, so I would maintain that Germany is it's a matter of degree. If you had Germany by itself, you'd say, gee, that's a sort of dismal picture. The Germans only look good because the other 3 look really, they really are worse. And somebody suggested that doing one of the Scandinavian countries, which have high percentage, like relative, not really big, but more. See, this is there. Take a look at that. Percent of gross national income spent on overseas aid. Well, if we had some of the Scandinavian countries there, we'd have numbers up around 1.5% to 2%. It'd be really interesting to study them. They'd be a nice case to see whether our model continues to work. But the big story is, so far, the generality of the findings, okay? Now, for as far as doing something about it, if you want a message, what do you do about it? And that's the really hard thing. I think establishing this baseline is not too hard, but then coming along and say, okay, what can we do, to try to improve
I
this
assume there are
situation.
going to be policy implications from
That's right. That's exactly right.
But
Let me just say one thing on policy. One of the things we've just found very recently, we had a debate, we were at the Gates Foundation in Washington during the APSA meeting, and people started asking me about the impact of leaders as heuristic, like the messages from leaders. And as some of you may know, David Cameron has been, particularly for a conservative, has been a very strong proponent of overseas aid. And some people say, leaders don't matter for this, blah, blah. And I said, well, let's see. Well, it turns out that Cameron, consistently across a wide variety of specifications, the Cameron heuristic really works. So there's evidence to suggest that leaders could indeed lead on overseas aid.
I can see Margaret Thatcher smiling behind you.
Well, I'm sure. Yes.
Ed?
Your scene set for your questionnaire, I assume, makes it clear that you're only talking about government channeled humanitarian aid, but at least in the United States, to some extent, these other 3 countries, there's a lot of private aid.
There is. That's right. We ask about that as well. Charitable giving, more generally, not just, and in fact, not just aid either. Other kinds of charitable giving, to see the extent to which it's sort of nested as part of a more general sort of attitude.
Any
Do
difference?
they crowd each other out?
In the States, they're seen really, they're alternatives, and the Americans are the only place where you really see a lot of emphasis on doing this outside of government, more privately, and also it's the only place where you see that religious, working with faith-based organizations is like important. People talk about this. Well, how should we deliver aid? We say, well, have the government do it, government to government, like we say, or government to private entities, or have it done through a religious organization. Only in the United States do you get, and it's actually fairly sizable. So in terms of delivery mechanisms, you're right. There is a distinction then.
And
This
Harold,
is where the United States starts to actually look different.
Harold,
That's
do you
right.
have a self-help kind of question in here somewhere? I mean, does this vary? I would think it would vary quite markedly across the 4 countries.
What are you thinking of, Jim?
Well, I mean, I think U.S. My guess is that U.S. attitudes towards this would be strongly inclined towards self-help. You know, that there should be. We shouldn't be doing this because
Pull yourselves up by
people
your bootstraps.
should be bootstrapping their way up here.
Yeah, we're doing some stuff on values. As some of you may know, there's psychologists, of course, they have their 50-item battery on this, that, and the other. And one of the things they have, there's something called the Schwartz Wheel of Values, which has been used quite a bit in cross-national work. You can boil that down to about 10 items. And we have worked on that. And there's an egocentric, sort of like self. Like, you know, look out for number one. I'm number one. You know, look at me. I'm great. Kind of factor. And then there's an egalitarianism factor. The first one I thought would work just along the lines you suggest. It doesn't. It doesn't work, or doesn't work hardly at all anywhere. The egalitarian one works just the way you'd think it would. Another thing we want to work on are some of the personality batteries as well. You know, other kinds of things, not just values, but there's this big 5 personality factors and so forth. We want to look at some of those things.
Okay, Carissa's had her hand up for a minute. It's always the same people asking questions.
That's right. You're not getting through, Jim.
But we're going to start calling on students.
You have to ask them. Yeah.
So I'm interested in you've got the sort of the morality, benefits, cost things, and then the sort of the liberal, conservative, demographic things. And I'm wondering, like how endogenous those are, or how closely correlated those are. How much of your feelings about the benefits and costs and morality of aid come out of your existing liberalism, gender, etc.?
I think, well, that's, very, very interesting question. And one of the things that we see is that the racial and ethnic attitudes and the ethnocentrism, for example, and to a lesser extent liberal conservative beliefs or left-right scales in the European countries, do in fact influence perceived benefits, costs, and morality in predictable ways. The racial ethnic stuff is really powerful. I was surprised. These are questions that don't have anything in the world on their face to do with anything about aid or public policy except policies like affirmative action policies is where they came originally came from.
When you say the racial ethnic stuff, could you tell us what that means exactly?
What 4 questions? Does anybody know the Sears-Tesler research in the United States?
What is it?
Yeah, David Sears and Michael Tesler's research, the American National Election Studies. There are four standard questions that ask, for example, attitudes about affirmative action. And another question, one of them is phrased, well, generations of slavery have made it very difficult for African Americans to work their way out of poverty. The second item is, if African Americans just worked harder, the pull yourself up question, then they could be just as successful. After all, other minority groups have done so, and they've mentioned the Irish and the Jews and so on. That's a standard battery, but it has nothing at all on its face about aid or about most policies other than affirmative action. Varieties of that thing work exactly the same in all 4 countries and have very powerful sort of indirect effects. And that was the question battery.
What I hear you saying is that there's a latent racialism.
You're darn right.
In these countries that explains a lot of the attitudes.
A lot of the aid is going to Africa and to countries in the Middle East and so forth. And it turns out that ethnocentrism and racial ethnic attitudes matter.
So this is a variant of the white man's burden, is what you're saying.
Well, it's something that surprised. It was something that actually turns out to be stronger than partisanship. It's stronger than liberal conservative value. The standard liberal conservative stuff. That surprised me.
Let's go to the student and then Sandy.
Is that the ethnocentrism? Is that surprising to you? Because it seems surprising to me that's. Especially the racialism.
Well, the ethnocentrism, a little different sort of concept, and it's predictable. What wasn't predictable to me was just how strong it was, because we have these questions. We're proxying ethnocentrism with questions about immigration. And it turns out that these things not only have predictable relationships, but they're really strong. That's what I'm saying. You think, as I say, you've got this sort of profile, liberals, Democrats, women, young people. Well, that's all true, but these other things are much stronger. That's what we're finding.
Sandy, and then Hiroki, and then...
Following up on Jim's earlier question, it strikes me that the three other countries besides the U.S. have more fully developed welfare states, and of course Scandinavian countries have even more fully developed. So I'm wondering, to pick up on your question, is there a correlation between the willingness of countries for government aid domestically and government aid to foreign aid, because it would seem to be a spectrum of things that this differentiates the U.S. from the European country and then Scandinavian countries.
And just to interject there, it would be very interesting to look at the Swiss case, because I think the Swiss are way up near the top in terms of ODA, if I'm not mistaken.
As a percentage of their income?
No?
Let me give you just one hint on this. The role of government is really what we're talking about, sort of more generally. One of the things we're seeing, this came up in our recent conversations in Washington, done some analysis on this, trust in government. Net of everything else, trust in government works just the way that you would expect. More trusting people are more positive towards government provision of aid, probably more trusting of government provision of lots of things, net of all these other considerations. So I think there's some hint in our data, even without having a Scandinavian case, that you're probably right, that conjecture is correct, yeah.
Let's go here to the student first.
Yeah, do you think about having a survey in aid receiving countries? Just
would love to.
That was actually my other question.
I've been trying to do that. Okay, I'll get you to talk to these guys, because that's exactly what I said. There are two other kinds of cases that I was interested in. One was the new donor countries, like East Asian democracies, which have moved from being recipients to being donors or potential donors. Then secondly, to actually try to do some survey work in recipient countries. And I think that'd be a great idea. I think that would be really interesting, and maybe would move us along the line of understanding more about what makes aid effective. You could tie it up to that.
I'm just really curious if you gave the exact same survey to the recipient countries.
Maybe people might just say, well, we don't want aid because it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Who was the African woman economist?
That was
Moyo.
Yeah.
Who wrote the book?
Moyo.
Yeah,
for the students in the...
Yeah, that's possible. That'd be really interesting if that's the way it turned out. That that negative attitudes towards aid, actually are found in the recipient countries as well. But so far, I've not been able to get that. They will move to Norway. I think we're going to do Norway, but we have not been able to get to the other cases.
What was the title of her book?
Dead Aid.
Dead Aid. That's what I was just trying.
Yeah, there are a number of these books out. That
Hiroki, I'll come back to you in a minute.
Yeah.
Thomas and then Stephen.
All right. So my question. So what I can tell from your study, I know I came in a little bit late at class, but what I can tell from your study is you're looking at a singular government-to-government sort of style of aid. What role do you think, like a multilateral donor bank, such as like the World Bank, how do people? Do you think the survey responses would have changed significantly when there's more players involved?
Harold, I should point out that Thomas hails from a place called Chapel Hill.
Oh, he does. All right. I lived in Chapel Hill for 3.5 years. No, we're asking, and these a lot of our questions have to do with government provision of overseas aid. But of course, we also ask about who government gives the aid to. Do they give it to other governments? Do they give it to various non-governmental organizations? Do they try to reach through directly to individuals and so on? And that that varies somewhat across the countries in fairly predictable ways. The Americans are, again, getting government out of the way in this. They would like to do more, just giving directly. Then, again, this trust in government phenomena varies cross-nationally. But as I say, in terms of government being the actor, there's a lot of similarities here, as you've seen right from the beginning. I was surprised. I thought the United States would really be... At first, when we first did that first one back in 2012, that one I mentioned that was designed in the Fairfax Hotel, we were doing UK, Germany, France, and Spain. No U.S. And I said, "Oh, you guys are nuts! You've got to come on. Let's go. We've got to get the U.S. in there because it's A, the amount of money that's involved, and B, it's going to be the big contrasting case." Well, I was right about the big amount of money, of course. That's obvious. But the contrasting case, not really. Not really.
This is, for the students in the room, this is a case where Professor Clarke had a hypothesis. He thought for sure he was going to find one thing, and
he didn't.
Actually, when you do the
take a look at these numbers here, you don't. You just don't, and that's really interesting.
Well,
and
yeah,
so Americans are outliers. You know, they are in some ways, but not.
The next time somebody tells you Americans are just more selfish and stingy and immoral, you can say, well, that's actually probably not true.
Well, one of the things we're doing right now, we're doing just parenthetically in terms of cross-national survey research. We're doing, in fact, we just got a grant from the National Science Foundation, as well as the British ESRC, which is the equivalent organization there, to study attitudes towards foreign affairs, and in particular attitudes towards conflicts, like in the Ukraine. America's role with regard to conflicts, like in the Ukraine. In the Middle East, Syria, Iraq.
Syria, right?
Yeah, we're already doing, some of this is ongoing, and we're just getting ready to go into the field to do more research, of course. And we're also going to be studying health, like Ebola in particular. Attitudes to what should the United States, what should developed countries be doing with regard to this. So we're doing more of this kind of work, and it's very interesting. Yeah.
Back to the point that this gentleman raised about polling the foreign countries. I've seen a couple of videos, I think off YouTube, and I don't remember which countries they were, but there were foreign officials going on camera and saying, "We don't want your foreign aid, we want you to change your foreign policy." So it seems like we're shoving the aid down their throat, whether they want it or not, and putting strings attached to it.
Yeah, we had a question earlier about that, about recipient countries and how people would feel, not public officials in those countries. I think that's a great idea. I would love to do that in selected cases in recipient countries, if we could do that. The surveys, it gets hard to survey, of course. We're in a great position here now in the early 21st century in terms of doing survey research in mature democracies. It's like really easy to do. Even in countries like Taiwan, where I do a lot of research as well, it's very easy. But once you get out into developing countries again, it's much more difficult. And much more expensive.
Is your work open source or proprietary? Or?
It's proprietary right now for this project, because this is paid for by our client. I'm hoping, though, that it will all be public, in the future. That is not true, though. The stuff we do on attitudes towards foreign affairs and election studies and things like that. Oh, by the way, we're going to be studying as well how attitudes towards foreign affairs affect the outcome of the 2014 congressional elections. Historically, the argument is that that domestic politics stops at the water's edge, and that foreign affairs are sort of irrelevant to domestic elections. And we're challenging that.
And that's been by and large true for most of it.
It's interesting. It's interesting, but over the last decade, actually, or so, that really has become increasingly less the case. Certainly, the decision of the Bush administration to go into Iraq was really a precipitating event, both here and in Great Britain, where Tony Blair, former Prime Minister Blair, suffered greatly.
He's in this corner behind you.
Because yes, well, he made right here in this university, of course. Yes, that's right. And so I think that's changing. And right now, of course, for better or for worse, our president has been getting a lot of heat about his action, or better, inaction, with regard to situations in Syria and Iraq and so on. So we'll be studying that as we roll out these surveys.
Let Professor Takeuchi ask a question, and then we'll take any last question before we stop. But Professor Takeuchi Sensei.
My question, yes, it is redundant. But, well, my question is: do you ask them like whether they know or how much they know which country is a recipient of the aid? Right, because usually we assume, or public would assume, that it is for development and solving the poverty. But actually, who would be the recipient is not determined solely by the level of the poverty, right? So and then so usually public might be surprised that with hearing that which countries are the major recipients of aid. So that's the one question. And then another question which is related to that is how much is your finding deviated from the hypothesis that those who are more well-informed would tend to support foreign aid? I ask this question because I imagine that the general public would be like, well, we don't know how much aid U.S. is providing, but we know that the U.S. is providing foreign aid. But we always hear there is a poverty issue. We are under the threat of terrorism, and we have heard a lot of the news about corrupt politicians in developing countries. And then if public connects these dots together, then you would easily conclude that, well, aid is going to corrupt politicians. That's why we cannot solve the problem of terrorism or problem of poverty. Therefore, I would not support the foreign aid. But that's actually superficially connecting the dots, right? So the second question that I have is how much your finding is deviated from the hypothesis that those who are well informed tends to support foreign aid.
Yeah, the conjecture about the extent of heterogeneity, with regard to something like knowledge. So far, we've asked a few questions about this. Haven't done a lot of analysis of that. Using education, though, as a proxy, which is a pretty decent proxy for being plugged into information and being able to process it and so forth. It's a very minor correlate. It's there, but it works predictably. Yes, people who are better educated are more supportive of aid, but it's a very minor correlate. Well, you can get some fairly fancy models, as you may know, about the heterogeneity, the interaction effects of knowledge with some of these heuristics and so on. And that's actually a really interesting area to pursue in terms of messaging, like who's the messenger. And there's an old argument, of course, that leader heuristics are sort of like for dummies. The smart people try to figure out the equilibrium. I say the guys who tried to do that were eaten by the tiger a long time ago, and that it's probably the smarter guys who use the heuristics. But we've done some work on that, not in this context. The other point that I think is really good is to learn more about perceptions of where the aid money goes in terms not of programs, we've had to talk about that, but also countries, like who gets it. And I think that's really good. And I take that on board going ahead. I think that'd be a really good battery to do. I think
one of our students who is studies development has a question. Rafiq Farouk in the back.
A few summers ago, I had the opportunity to work with Give India and Lift Bangla, which are diaspora philanthropy portals that target immigrants here. And we called it the empathy measure, which is people who have seen development and experience conditions of poverty are more likely to get aid. A simple analytical argument. And so in the last year, Give India had 2 million unique donations from the United States, and Lift Bangla had 400,000 unique donations. Wow. So my question is, as the demographics of the United States change, as we have more migrants, and as you already said, youth are more likely to support aid, do you think in the long run there will be a natural shift towards preferences for ODA?
I think that take the age. Let's take age. Of course, the classic debate about age is whether it's a generational or a life cycle phenomenon, and we have not sorted that out at all with regard to this. We've been doing work on this in terms of attitudes towards democracy in Taiwan. We've actually been studying it, but not here. So I don't know the answer to that. The empathy thing, though, we've been doing some of our survey experiments tap in to empathy, and I think that you might extend that. You may say, okay, what about taking a look at the backgrounds, the national backgrounds, the ethnicity of different people in terms of their. I think that's a good idea. I think that's interesting, And it would be well worth, again, doing as we start doing more work on the messaging. And who you like, what works, and who does it work with. In fact, yeah, that's a good idea.
Harold, I have a somewhat related question, which goes back to your 4 cases. And I'm wondering if you thought about this or looked at it. 2 of those countries were big colonial powers. So the question is, does having a colonial past somehow influence this?
I think that's really a very interesting. Certainly the messaging, the pitch, as I said early on.
What's that?
You better ask the recipients.
Well, I mean, the French giving.
Well,
aid
no, but the pitch that was made when I was a kid, this I can speak from personal experience, was very much cast in terms of not just helping poor people, but helping poor people in another Commonwealth country. In the early 60s, when they were making this pitch to us kids, that's what they were saying. Now, I don't know whether those kinds of messages are used these days at all. I have no idea. I doubt it. Maybe in Britain too, a little bit with a conservative government. With a conservative government. But it'd be, again, it's something to think about. It's part of this It's this idea of who you're giving money to. It's who you're giving money to, and that's one of the things I've heard this afternoon. And I like that idea. I think that's a good idea. You can think about it in terms of former political ties. You can think of it in terms of ethnic ties. Other kinds of ties that people might have. But I think that's a good idea.
Reaction to that.
Well, one interesting example is Japan, and Japan takes like a war guilt as one of the major reasons to choose which countries Japan should give aid. And so as a result, for a long time, the major recipient of Japanese foreign aid was China. Mm-hmm. And then Japan specifically officially says that.
Would you find the same thing for the Germans? The Germans have the war guilt.
Well, but
that would be
is it included in the purpose of foreign aid? I'm not sure.
It's not clear who that would cause them to direct money.
Certainly Israel.
Well, yeah.
That's not
On the other hand, you remember the Marshall Plan. Russia.
Yeah, but the French certainly give disproportionately to former French colonies.
There are those ties, I think, and they're worth studying. I don't know in terms of messaging whether they're actually messaging it or it's just something they do. They guys say, okay, I know this guy here, and so I do it. I just don't know. Somebody maybe in this room might be able to tell me, but it's certainly worthwhile studying in a survey context. What people, what they think. And that's very interesting about Japan. I didn't know that.
And Japan has actually higher support for foreign aid than these countries. So I do not have specific numbers, but actually the range of the number is actually much higher than the range of these numbers. So maybe M is higher in Japan than these countries. Yeah.
Well, if you got the money, I'll certainly go.
Well, is there any final question or thought? Sandy, you get the last word or last question.
There's a literature in philosophy which distinguishes between ethics in regard to your family, immediate family, extended family, and others, outside that order. Mm-hmm. And I think the Commonwealth example can be viewed as an extension of that internationally. Commonwealth countries are members of your extended family, therefore you have a special ethical obligation to them that you do not have to those undefined others.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. That's a good idea. And I've got lots of good ideas here, Jim. This is great. Yeah.
Well, listen, it's because we have such great students.
There you go. And great colleagues.
Let's give them another round of applause.
Thanks very much, folks.
Thank you all for coming.
Appreciate it. Appreciate
Learn more about the Tower Center, and thanks to Professor Brown for bringing.
Thanks, folks.
Nice to be with you. Enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I'd love for you to give this information to the Inter-American Foundation whenever it's public domain or something.
Yeah.
Peter, you were thinking.
Yeah, just brief. It's a federal agency, but we're also a public charity. So we're going to start raising.
Thank you, Kate, for the emergency computer usage.
Don't forget your sign-up.
Anything like that. The hurdle is trying to convince people it's beneficial.
Oh, sure. No, that's the, no, it's one thing to document the importance of perceived benefits, another thing to actually change their mind. Exactly. So I'd be happy to talk anytime.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're watching it, so you don't care.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Take care.
I'll see you guys.
Did you find that on experience?
anti-malarial programs in Africa.
Okay, Kate, you got your computer.
Education and development.
Okay, 10 minutes.
The third or fourth and fifth
Spent
world.
weekends in Durham. Got to tour Duke campus.
Wondering, some of the international companies,
Oh, you mean the
not just those companies.
Oh yeah. Oh, so you're also involved.
He was just
no,
there
I'm
last
just
week.
informed.
Sure.
Oh yeah. I did that just before coming.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
No, it's a very pretty place.
Quantifying effectiveness. Have you ever tried to sort of connect that body of knowledge and those activities?
No, I haven't. No, I've worked strictly with the survey data here now. Some of the partners, organizations
Well,
that
mine was something just downtown. Really
provide
close
both
to
input and get these surveys, do those kinds of things.
Not like you used to.
And some of them, of course, like DFID in the UK, Department for International Development, is one of our partners. And of course, they got a whole range of activities that they're doing.
Yes, he's really close.
But as far as I'm concerned, no, I've just been the survey researcher on this.
He's even much more.
Oh, really?
And his wife was in my class. They're both professors. Both Canadian.
Yes.
Robert, you were awfully quiet back there.
Yes,
I was.
Yeah.
You were not in the amen corner back there.
But that's interesting. I didn't know that.
I don't
know, but I
Most other countries are much more streamlined.
Seminar being
Most other countries have more streamlined.
centralized.
More centralized. Well, yeah. So fewer discrete agencies.
Well, yeah, the United States, of course.